January 12, 1945. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. 22 degrees below zero. A train groans to a stop. Steam hisses into frozen air. The doors slide open. 200 German women step onto American soil for the first time. Nurses, radio operators, military auxiliaries. They wear thin summer uniforms meant for French autumn. Their breath freezes the moment it leaves their lips. Back home, Nazi radio had painted a clear picture. American captivity meant one thing: death, slow, cold, forgotten in the snow. Helga Brenner was 23 years old, a nurse from Munich. She looked at the endless white landscape and thought, this is where we die. But 72 hours later, she was sitting in a warm mess hall, eating scrambled eggs, bacon, fresh bread with butter, and an American farm woman was wrapping a hand-knitted wool scarf around her neck. The same enemy she was taught to fear was saving her life. This wasn't supposed to happen. This broke every rule of war, every piece of propaganda, every expectation. And yet, it happened. All of it. Documented. Verified. Real. What you're about to hear is one of the most remarkable survival stories of World War II. Not because of battles or bombs, but because of something far more dangerous to hatred: kindness. This channel exists to bring you forgotten history that changes how you see the world. If that matters to you, hit subscribe right now, turn on notifications, and support this channel by watching until the very end. Because what these German women learned in the frozen Wisconsin winter didn't just save their lives, it shattered everything they believed about their enemy. Let me show you how it began. January 12, 1945. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Outside, the world was white. Snow covered everything: trees, roads, buildings, all buried under a thick frozen blanket. Inside the train cars, 200 German women sat in silence. They were not soldiers in the usual sense. They were nurses, radio operators, office workers, signals auxiliaries, women who had served the Wehrmacht in different ways. Most had been captured in France after the Allied invasion. Others came from field hospitals overrun in Belgium. Now they were prisoners, and they were about to step into a cold they had never known. Helga Brenner pressed her face against the frozen window. She was 23 years old, a nurse from Munich. She had joined the war effort in 1942, believing she was doing her duty. Now she was 5,000 miles from home, staring at a land that looked like the end of the world. The temperature outside was 18 degrees below zero. "This is where they send us to die," whispered Inge Schade, a signals operator sitting beside her. She was only 20. Her hands were shaking, not just from cold, from fear. They had all heard the stories. Nazi propaganda had painted a clear picture of American captivity. Women would be abused, starved, left to freeze in open camps. Berlin radio said American soldiers were savages. It said captured Germans, especially women, would face horrors too dark to describe. So when the train doors opened, they expected monsters. What they saw instead was snow, mountains of it, and American soldiers who looked just as cold as they were. "Raus! Everybody out!" The order came in broken German. The women stood slowly. Their legs were stiff from 3 days of travel. The air hit them like a wall of ice. Helga gasped. The cold entered her lungs and burned. It felt like swallowing fire made of frost. They wore thin uniforms. Summer weight, meant for French autumn, not Wisconsin winter. No gloves, no scarves, boots that were already falling apart. One woman, a 19-year-old named Liesel Hartmann, took 3 steps onto the platform and collapsed. Her legs simply gave out. The cold had stolen her strength in seconds. An American guard rushed over. He didn't yell. He didn't hit her. He picked her up and carried her toward a waiting truck. Helga watched this, confused. This was not what she had been told. The women were loaded into canvas-covered trucks, 30 per vehicle. The ride to camp took 20 minutes. It felt like hours. The wind cut through the canvas like it wasn't there. Women huddled together, sharing what little body heat they had. Inge's teeth chattered so loud Helga could hear them over the engine. "I can't feel my feet," Inge said. "Don't think about it," Helga replied. "Just keep moving your toes." But Helga couldn't feel her own feet either. When they arrived at Camp McCoy, they saw rows of wooden barracks. Simple buildings, long and low. Smoke rose from small chimneys. At least there would be heat. That was something. The camp held over 4,000 prisoners in total. Most were men. The women's section was separate, smaller. 200 women in 4 barracks, 50 per building. They were lined up in the snow for processing. Names taken, numbers assigned. Basic medical checks done by American doctors who spoke no German. The whole thing took 2 hours. 2 hours standing in 18 below cold. By the end, 11 women had frostbite on their fingers. 3 had it on their ears. Liesel Hartmann, the girl who had collapsed, had it on both feet. A German-speaking American officer addressed them before they entered the barracks. "You are prisoners of war," he said. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will work. You will follow rules. You will not be harmed." Helga listened. She wanted to believe him, but the propaganda echoed in her mind. Americans lie. Americans are cruel. This is a trick. That night the women entered their barracks for the first time. Thin walls, small iron stoves, cots with rough blankets. It was warmer than outside, but still cold, still hard. Helga lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling. Her fingers throbbed. Her ears ached. She could hear women crying in the dark. Soft, quiet sobs of exhaustion and fear. Gerda didn't make it to the barracks. Someone whispered they took her to the infirmary. Hypothermia. Helga closed her eyes. They had survived the war. They had survived capture. Now they had to survive winter, and winter here was a predator. She thought about what the officer had said. "You will not be harmed." But the cold was harm. The thin walls were harm. The inadequate clothing was harm. Maybe they didn't need to shoot us, she thought. Maybe the snow will do it for them. She pulled the rough blanket tighter. It smelled of wool and dust. Not enough, not nearly enough, but as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, she did not know what was coming. She did not know that help was already on its way. Not from the military, not from Washington, from the people of Wisconsin. And what they would do next would change everything these women believed about their enemy. Morning came slowly. Grey light crept through the frost-covered windows. Helga woke to the sound of a bell ringing outside. Her body ached. Her fingers still throbbed from yesterday's cold. But she was alive. She looked around the barracks. 49 other women were stirring on their cots. Some moved quickly. Others stayed curled under their blankets, unwilling to face another frozen day. The stove in the center of the room had gone out during the night. The temperature inside was barely warmer than a refrigerator. Helga could see her breath hanging in the air like tiny clouds. Aufstehen. Everyone up. A female American guard stood at the door. She didn't yell. Her voice was firm, but not cruel. She waited as the women slowly rose from their cots. "Breakfast in 15 minutes, she said in accented German. "Then work assignments." Breakfast. Helga almost laughed. In the last months of the war, breakfast had meant watery soup, sometimes just hot water with a few cabbage leaves floating in it. Germany was starving, the army was starving, everyone was starving. She expected the same here. Thin gruel, stale bread, maybe nothing at all. What she found in the mess hall made her stop walking. Long tables were set with metal trays. On each tray sat scrambled eggs, real eggs, thick slices of bread with butter, hot coffee, and bacon. Actual bacon, pink and crispy, the smell filling the entire room. Helga stared. She had not seen this much food in over a year. "Is this real?" Inge whispered beside her. It was real, and it was for them. The women ate in stunned silence. Some cried as they chewed, not from sadness, from shock, from the overwhelming taste of food they had forgotten existed. Helga bit into the bread. It was soft, fresh. The butter melted on her tongue. She thought of her mother back in Munich, who was probably eating turnip soup right now. If she was eating at all, here she was, a prisoner, eating better than her own family. This was the first crack in the wall of propaganda. After breakfast came work assignments. The women were divided into groups. Some would work in the camp laundry, others in the kitchen. Some would sew and mend uniforms. A few with medical training, like Helga, were assigned to the camp infirmary. The work was hard, 10 hours a day, but it was not brutal. There were breaks. There was lunch, another full meal, soup with real vegetables, bread again, sometimes cheese. Helga worked alongside an American nurse named Dorothy. Dorothy was from a small town in Minnesota. She was 28 years old with red hair and freckles. She spoke no German. Helga spoke little English. But they communicated anyway, through gestures, through smiles, through the universal language of medicine. One day, Dorothy handed Helga a cup of hot chocolate. "For you," she said simply. Helga held the warm cup in her hands. The smell was rich and sweet. She had not tasted chocolate since 1941. 4 years. She took a small sip and felt tears form in her eyes. "Thank you," she managed in broken English. Dorothy smiled. "You're welcome. This was not cruelty. This was kindness. Small, simple kindness." But the cold remained their enemy. The barracks were still freezing. The stoves were still weak. Clothing was still thin. By the end of the first week, 23 women had reported to the infirmary with frostbite symptoms. 4 had severe cases requiring daily treatment. Gerda Miller, the woman taken on arrival night, lost 2 toes. The camp doctor did everything he could, but the damage was done before she ever reached the hospital building. At night, the women huddled together for warmth. They pushed cots closer. They shared blankets. They learned to sleep in shifts, with some women keeping the stove fed while others rested. "We are surviving," Inge said one night. "But barely." Helga nodded. The Americans were not trying to kill them. That much was clear now. The food was proof. The medical care was proof. But the winter was still deadly, and the military had not provided enough protection against it. The women talked about this constantly. Why bring them here without proper clothing? Was it carelessness? Was it a shortage? Or did the Americans simply not understand how deadly their own winter could be? The answer came from an unexpected source. One morning, an American sergeant gathered the women after breakfast. He looked uncomfortable, almost embarrassed. "There's been a mistake," he said through a translator. "Your winter supplies were sent to the wrong camp. We're working on getting replacements." A mistake. Not cruelty. Not a plan to freeze them. Just a bureaucratic error in the massive machine of war. Some women laughed bitterly. Others shook their heads. A mistake that could kill them. But the sergeant wasn't finished. "In the meantime," he said, "some local people want to help." Local people. Civilians. Americans who lived in the towns near the camp. Helga didn't understand. Why would enemy civilians help enemy prisoners? It made no sense. Nothing in her training prepared her for this. Nothing in the propaganda explained it. But that afternoon, the first truck arrived. It wasn't military. It was an old civilian pickup, painted blue, with rust on the doors, and driving it was a woman in her 50s, wearing a heavy wool coat and a kind smile. Her name was Ruth Henderson. She was a farmer's wife from the nearby town of Sparta, and in the back of her truck were 200 hand-knitted scarves made by the women of her church. The guards didn't know what to do. The prisoners didn't know what to think, but Ruth Henderson knew exactly what she was doing. She had seen the train arrive, she had seen the thin uniforms, and she had decided that freezing women, enemy or not, was not something she could ignore. What happened next would change everything. Ruth Henderson didn't ask permission. She parked her truck outside the women's barracks and started unloading scarves, thick wool scarves in different colors, red, blue, green, gray, each one hand-knitted. Each one made by a different woman from the Sparta Methodist Church. The camp commandant came out to see what was happening. "Ma'am, I'm not sure this is allowed," he said. Ruth looked at him over her glasses. "Are those women cold?" "Yes, ma'am, but..." "Then it's allowed." She handed him a scarf. "Give this to the one with the red hair." "She looks frozen." The commandant stood there holding a bright blue scarf. He looked confused. Then he smiled. "Yes, ma'am." The women prisoners were called out. They stood in formation, uncertain. Another inspection? Another roll call? They didn't know. Then Ruth started handing out scarves, one by one. She looked each woman in the eyes as she did it. She smiled. She nodded. She didn't speak German, but her message was clear. "You are cold. Here is warmth. That's all." Helga received a green scarf. The wool was soft, heavy. She wrapped it around her neck and felt immediate warmth. Real warmth. Her eyes filled with tears. "Dank," she whispered. Ruth didn't understand the word, but she understood the gratitude. She patted Helga's shoulder and moved to the next woman. Inge got a red scarf. Liesel got a grey one. Every woman received one, all 200. Ruth had brought exactly enough. After she left, the women stood in silence. They touched their scarves. They looked at each other. Finally, someone spoke. Why would they do this? No one had an answer. But Ruth Henderson was just the beginning. 2 days later, another truck arrived. This one brought coats. Heavy winter coats. Donated by families in 3 different towns. Toma, Sparta, La Crosse. People had cleaned out their closets. Some were old coats. Some were nearly new. All were warm. The Lutheran Church delivered 150 pairs of wool socks. The Catholic Women's Guild brought mittens and gloves. A retired schoolteacher named Margaret Klein showed up with a station wagon full of flannel nightgowns. "Can't sleep in the cold wearing those thin things," she told the camp doctor. Over the next 3 weeks, 17 different groups of civilians brought supplies, food, clothing, blankets. One farmer donated 40 pounds of butter. A dairy in Sparta sent fresh milk every week. A woman who owned a bakery brought bread still warm from the oven. The military didn't organize this. No government program funded it. No general ordered it. This was ordinary people making an extraordinary choice. Helga couldn't process it. She worked in the infirmary trying to understand. Why help the enemy? Germany had bombed Allied cities, killed Allied soldiers, started the whole terrible war. And now these Americans were knitting scarves? She asked Dorothy, the red-haired nurse, one afternoon while they changed bandages. "Why you help us?" Helga asked in careful English. Dorothy thought for a moment. "Because you're cold. Because you're here. Because it's the right thing to do. But, we are enemy. Dorothy looked at her. You're also human. That comes first. This simple statement broke something inside Helga. All the propaganda, all the teaching about racial superiority, about enemies and allies, about us versus them. It all shattered against the reality of a Minnesota farm girl who believed humanity came first. The women began to change. Slowly, carefully. They worked harder, not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to. It felt like repaying a debt. When Ruth Henderson came back with another load of supplies, the women cheered. Actually cheered for an American civilian. Margaret Klein became a regular visitor. She was 67 years old, a widow. Her son had died at Normandy, killed by German artillery in June 1944. She had every reason to hate these German women. Instead, she taught them English phrases. She brought books. She sat in the barracks on cold evenings and talked with them through a translator. About life, about farming, about Wisconsin winters. One night, Inge asked her the question they all wondered. Your son, Germans killed him. Why you help us? Margaret was quiet for a long time. The barracks was silent. Everyone waited. My son died fighting cruelty, she finally said. If I'm cruel to you, then what did he die for? I honor him by being better than the thing he fought against. There was not a dry eye in that barracks. By February, the death rate among the women prisoners remained 0. Frostbite cases dropped dramatically, from 23 in the first week to just 3 in all of February. And those 3 were minor, no amputations, no permanent damage. Compare this to other POW camps. Camp Concordia in Kansas reported 6 deaths from cold exposure that same winter. Fort Robinson in Nebraska lost 4. Camp McCoy's male prisoners lost 2. The women's section lost none. The difference was simple. The women had received help. Not because of military efficiency, not because of government orders, but because ordinary Americans decided that freezing women was wrong, no matter what uniform they once wore. But the scarves and coats weren't enough to survive what was coming. Wisconsin winter had one more test, one final trial that would push every lesson to its limit. And this time the help would come from someone even more unexpected. A man who understood this land better than anyone. A man whose ancestors had survived these winters for thousands of years. His name was Samuel Red Cloud, and what he taught them would mean the difference between life and death. Samuel Red Cloud arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-February. He was Ho-Chunk. His people had lived in Wisconsin for over 12,000 years. Long before Germany existed, long before America existed, his ancestors knew this land when glaciers still covered it. He was 58 years old, quiet, strong. He wore a heavy coat made of deer hide and wool. His face was weathered like old leather. His eyes missed nothing. He came to the camp gate and asked to speak with the commandant. I heard you have women who don't know winter, he said. I can teach them. The commandant was surprised. You want to help German prisoners? Samuel looked at him steadily. I want to help people who are cold. Winter doesn't ask what country you're from. The commandant agreed. He had seen what the local civilians were doing. If a native elder wanted to help, who was he to refuse? Samuel gathered the women outside the barracks the next morning. 200 German women standing in the snow, staring at this American Indian man who had come to teach them. Most had never met a Native American. Nazi propaganda had told them nothing about indigenous peoples. These women were nurses, radio operators, office workers. They knew cities, hospitals, military bases, not forests, not survival. Samuel spoke through a translator, a young Ho-Chunk woman named Mary who worked at the camp as a clerk. Winter is not your enemy, Samuel began. Cold is not trying to kill you. You just don't understand it yet. Once you understand, you can live with it. He started with breathing. When air is this cold, don't breathe through your mouth. Breathe through your nose. Your nose warms the air before it reaches your lungs. Through your mouth you freeze from the inside. Such a simple thing. But none of them knew it. Helga had been breathing through her mouth for weeks, gasping in the cold. No wonder her chest always hurt. Next, Samuel taught them about layers. One thick coat is not enough. You need layers. Air trapped between layers keeps you warm. Wear everything you have. Thin shirt, then thicker shirt, then sweater, then coat. The air does the work. He showed them how to wrap their scarves properly. Not just around the neck, but covering the mouth and nose, leaving only the eyes exposed. Your breath makes moisture. Moisture freezes. Keep your face covered, but leave space for air to escape, the women practiced. Wrapping, re-wrapping, learning the right tightness, the right coverage. Then Samuel moved to the feet. Feet are most important. You lose your feet, you die. 2 pairs of socks always. Not tight. Tight cuts off blood. Loose is warmer. He taught them to wiggle their toes constantly. Keep blood moving. Never stand still for long in extreme cold. Always shift weight. Always move. If your toes go numb, don't ignore it. That's frostbite starting. Get inside immediately. Liesel listened carefully. She had already lost 2 toes. She wouldn't lose more. Samuel brought birch bark and dry grass. He showed them how to start a fire properly, how to build it so it gives heat, not just flame. Small fire, close together. Big fire wastes wood and you freeze on one side while the other burns. He demonstrated the Ho-Chunk method, a small, concentrated fire with a reflector behind it, a simple piece of metal or wood, angled to push heat forward. It doubled the warmth from the same amount of wood. The camp stove suddenly became twice as effective, but the most important lesson came next. Samuel took them into the woods outside the camp. Guards followed, but Samuel ignored them. He pointed to the trees. Every tree tells you about the wind. See how the snow builds on one side? That's the direction the wind comes from. Sleep on the opposite side of the room from that wall. Wind steals heat through wood. The women looked at the trees. Snow piled heavy on the northern side of every trunk. The north wall of their barracks faced that direction. That night, they moved their cots to the south side. The difference was immediate, noticeable, just from understanding wind. Samuel came back 3 times a week for a month. Each time he taught something new. How to recognize hypothermia in others before it becomes deadly. The stumbling, the confusion, the strange urge to remove clothing. How to build a snow wall for extra insulation. Snow, he explained, is mostly air. Air is insulation. Pack it right, and it protects you. How to eat for warmth. Fat keeps you warm. Protein keeps you warm. Bread fills your stomach, but doesn't heat your body. Eat the butter. Eat the meat. The women absorbed every word. This wasn't theory. This was survival knowledge tested over thousands of years. By March, the women moved differently, dressed differently, breathed differently. They walked through snow without exhausting themselves. They kept their fires small and efficient. They watched the trees and read the weather. Frostbite cases dropped to 0. Helga saw Samuel one afternoon and stopped him. "Why you teach us?" she asked. Her English was better now. "We are enemy." Samuel looked at the sky, at the trees, at the snow. "My people were enemies with the cavalry once," he said quietly. "They put us on reservations, took our land, but when winter came, some soldiers learned from us. Some died because they didn't. I teach because knowledge should not be a weapon. Cold kills everyone the same." He walked away before she could respond. The women had clothing now. They had knowledge. They had survived 2 months of Wisconsin winter. But winter wasn't finished with them yet. The worst storm in 50 years was forming over the Dakotas, moving east, bringing cold that would test everything they had learned. And it was coming fast. The warning came on February 23, 1945. A massive storm system was moving across the Great Plains. Weather stations reported record low temperatures, wind speeds over 60 miles per hour, snow measured in feet, not inches. The camp commandant called an emergency meeting. "All prisoners, all staff. This is serious," he said. "Worst storm in 50 years. Maybe worse. Everyone stays inside. No exceptions, no work details, no outdoor movement. We survive together, or we don't survive at all." The women returned to their barracks. They had 3 hours before the storm hit. Helga and the others immediately started preparing. Everything Samuel had taught them, everything the locals had shown them. Now it all mattered. They moved all cots to the south wall, away from the wind. They stuffed rags and paper into cracks around windows. They organized their clothing in layers, ready to wear everything at once. They stockpiled wood next to the stove. They filled every container with water before the pipes froze. Inge checked everyone's boots and socks. 2 pairs each. Make sure they're loose. Liesel helped arrange blankets for sharing. We sleep in groups. 4 women per cluster. Body heat. These were not the same frightened women who arrived 6 weeks ago. They had learned. They had changed. The storm hit at 2 p.m. The wind came first. It didn't blow. It screamed. A sound like a living thing, furious and hungry. The barracks shook. The windows rattled in their frames. Snow came horizontal, hitting the walls like thrown sand. Within an hour, visibility dropped to 0. You couldn't see 3 feet outside the windows. Just white, angry, swirling white. The temperature fell to 28 degrees below 0. With the wind, it felt like 50 below. Inside the barracks, the women huddled close. The small stove glowed red, but its heat barely reached the corners of the room. They rotated positions. Those in the center moved out. Those on the edges moved in. Everyone got time near the warmth. They wore every piece of clothing they owned. Shirts, sweaters, coats, scarves wrapped around heads and faces, mittens donated by the Catholic Women's Guild, socks from the Lutheran Church, Ruth Henderson's hand-knitted layers. They looked like bundles of fabric with eyes. Keep breathing through your noses, Helga reminded everyone. Samuel's lesson. It mattered now more than ever. The storm lasted 3 days, 72 hours of howling wind and blinding snow. The world outside disappeared. Time became strange. Day and night blurred together. They measured time in stove feedings, in rotation shifts, in cups of rationed water. Food was limited. The camp kitchen couldn't operate. They ate cold rations, bread, cheese, tinned meat, not enough for 3 days, but they made it work. They shared everything equally. No one hoarded. No one complained. On the second night, the stovepipe cracked. Smoke started filling the barracks. Panic could have killed them. Instead, they acted. One woman stuffed the crack with wet rags. Another adjusted the damper. A third opened a window just slightly to vent the smoke without losing all their heat. They worked together, quickly, efficiently. They were a team now. Outside, the storm raged. Snow piled against the barracks walls. Drifts rose to the windows. 10 feet, 12 feet. The building disappeared into a white tomb. On the third morning, the wind finally stopped. The silence was shocking. After 3 days of constant screaming wind, the quiet felt unnatural. Wrong. The women waited. Still huddled. Still cautious. Samuel had warned them. The storm's end is the most dangerous time. People rush out too soon. They celebrate too early. And the cold is still deadly. They waited 2 more hours. Then carefully the senior woman cracked open the door. Snow avalanched inside. A wall of white, packed solid. They were buried. It took an hour to dig out. Using boards, metal trays, bare hands. They tunneled through snow taller than any of them. Finally, they broke through to daylight. The world was transformed. Unrecognizable. Snow covered everything. The camp looked like a collection of white mounds. Trees bent under impossible weight. One barracks roof had collapsed. Not theirs. The men's section. 3 buildings down. Rescue crews were already digging. The camp had survived, but barely. Final count, Camp McCoy recorded wind gusts of 67 miles per hour. Total snowfall, 34 inches. Temperature low, 31 below zero. In the men's section, 2 prisoners died. Hypothermia. 1 American guard died trying to reach the infirmary during the storm. In the women's section, 0 deaths. 0 serious injuries. Not 1 case of severe frostbite. Every single woman survived. And then they saw something impossible. A truck was pushing through the snow toward their barracks. An old blue pickup. Rust on the doors. Ruth Henderson. She had driven through the aftermath of the worst storm in 50 years to check on them. In the truck bed, hot soup in insulated containers, fresh bread, blankets. Behind her came Margaret Klein in her station wagon. Then 3 men from the Ho-Chunk reservation with firewood and venison. Then the Lutheran church group with medical supplies. The civilians had risked their lives to bring help. The camp commandant stood in the snow, shaking his head in disbelief. "You people are absolutely crazy." Ruth Henderson smiled. "Maybe. But those girls needed soup." In that moment, something shifted. The women weren't prisoners anymore. Not really. They were neighbors who had survived a disaster together. The war still existed. The rules still applied. But something deeper had happened. Something the storm had revealed. They had become human to each other. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. The news reached Camp McCoy on a Tuesday morning. The war in Europe was over. After 6 years of destruction, the fighting had stopped. In the women's barracks, the reaction was complicated. Relief mixed with dread. The war was over. But what did that mean for them? What was left of home? Helga sat on her cot holding a letter from the Red Cross. Her mother was alive. Munich was destroyed, but her mother had survived. Tears ran down her face. Gratitude and grief all mixed together. Not everyone was so fortunate. 37 women in the camp received news that their families were gone. Homes bombed. Parents dead. Cities erased. Inge learned her entire street in Hamburg no longer existed. Just rubble and ash. The women would go home. But home was a memory now. A ghost. Repatriation began in July. The women were processed, documented, prepared for transport. They would travel by train to the East Coast, then by ship to Europe, back to a Germany they barely recognized. The night before the first group left, something unexpected happened. Ruth Henderson organized a farewell gathering. Not at the camp, at her farm. The military approved it. 20 women at a time were brought to Ruth's property for dinner. Real dinner. Around a table. Like human beings. Like guests. Helga's group was the third to go. She sat at Ruth's kitchen table eating pot roast and potatoes. The room smelled like home cooking and coffee. The walls were covered with family photos. A normal American farmhouse. 1962, Helga returned to Wisconsin. She was 40 years old now, married, a mother of 3, a nurse, in a Bonn hospital. She saved for 2 years to afford the trip. Ruth Henderson was 74, still strong, still farming. They sat in the same kitchen, at the same table. Helga's English was fluent now. "You saved my life," she said. Ruth shook her head. "Winter would have killed you. We just showed you how to live through it. There's a difference." "No," Helga said firmly. "You showed me humanity. That is what saved me. The winter was cold, but you were warm. That is what I needed most." 17 women eventually returned to visit Wisconsin. Some came once, some came multiple times. They brought their children, their grandchildren. They showed them the barracks where they survived, the town that helped them. Samuel Red Cloud died in 1979. At his funeral, there was a wreath sent from Germany, paid for by 23 former prisoners who never forgot the man who taught them to survive. Ruth Henderson died in 1983, age 95. Her obituary in the Sparta newspaper mentioned her work with POWs. Her family received 31 letters from Germany, from women, now elderly, who still remembered her kindness. Margaret Klein died in 1987. 14 former prisoners attended her funeral. They flew from Germany to honor the woman whose son died fighting their country, but who chose compassion over revenge. The paradox is complete now, clear, undeniable. They came as enemies. They left as students. They arrived expecting cruelty. They found humanity. They were taught to hate Americans. Instead, Americans taught them to survive. The greatest weapon was not bombs or bullets. It was kindness. It was scarves and soup. It was an elder teaching ancient knowledge. It was ordinary people choosing compassion when hate would have been easier. In the end, winter didn't care about flags or politics. Cold doesn't ask which side you fought for, and neither did the people of Wisconsin. They saw freezing women and decided that humanity came first. Everything else came second. That choice echoed across decades, across an ocean, across the gap between enemy and neighbor. Sometimes the war we're fighting isn't against people. It's against cold, against cruelty, against the idea that suffering is deserved. And the only way to win that war is together. The Camp McCoy women's section closed in late 1945. The barracks were eventually torn. The room smelled like home cooking and coffee. The walls were covered with family photos. A normal American farmhouse. Warm, safe, loved. Ruth served pie for dessert. Apple pie with cream. "I want you to remember something," Ruth said through Mary, the translator. "What happened here, between us, that was real. The war was the lie. This was the truth." Helga couldn't speak. She just nodded. Margaret Klein was there too. She gave each woman a small gift. A handkerchief embroidered with Wisconsin wildflowers. "Something to remember. You survived," Margaret said. "Now go home and build something better than what was destroyed." Samuel Red Cloud came to the camp the day before the last group departed. He didn't say much. He never did. He just shook hands with the women and gave them one final piece of advice. "Cold teaches you things," he said. "It teaches you that survival requires helping each other. Remember that when you go home. Your country forgot it. Don't you forget it." Between July and September 1945, all 200 women left Camp McCoy. They traveled across an ocean to a defeated nation, occupied, divided, starving. The contrast was brutal. In Wisconsin, they had been prisoners who ate eggs and bacon. In Germany, they were free citizens who stood in bread lines. But they carried something with them. Letters, addresses, promises to write, and they kept those promises. The first letter arrived at Ruth Henderson's farm in November 1945, from Helga, written in careful English. "Dear Mrs. Henderson, I am home now. Germany is very hard. No food like America, no heat like your stove, but I am alive because you gave me scarf. I think of you every day. Thank you for saving my life." Ruth cried reading it. She wrote back immediately. Over the next year, Ruth received 47 letters from former prisoners. Down. The land returned to forest and field. No monument marks the spot. But the legacy lives on in letters, in memories, in families who still tell the story. In 2003, a small plaque was placed in Sparta, Wisconsin. It reads, "In memory of the civilians who showed that even in war, kindness is possible." Beneath it are 4 names: Ruth Henderson, Margaret Klein, Samuel Red Cloud, and Dorothy Carlson, the nurse who first offered hot chocolate. The lesson remains simple. Winter doesn't care what flag you fight for, and sometimes, neither should we.